You're watching City Channel 4, your window to our community.
Now to our work session for Tuesday, August the 15th, hour being the Iowa City City Council. First topic is a presentation on Data-Driven Justice Initiative. Dave, nice to see you. But Jody's going to trample all over you there.
Oh, I guess so, yeah.
I just wanted to kick it off. First of all, Benjamin, you must have hit a phone booth because you were in flip-flops and shorts an hour ago when I was in a meeting with you. Changed out quickly. Folks, I wanted to introduce Officer David Schwint to you, and many of you already know Officer Schwint, but he's been with us 16 years, and this Data-Driven Justice Initiative is a really good example of public and private partnerships and some of the headway that we can make in problem solving what can seem like a long-term and very vague problem and really hone in on having solutions so that Officer Schwint's been a small piece of that, but a very critical piece of that. And I can tell you that he's, he'll never admit to this, but he's pretty much taken the lead on it and has been really good at being part of the solution to this. So with that, I won't steal his thunder. He'll do the piece on this, but just know we're in good hands with this, with Officer Schwint taking the lead on our end of it. So we appreciate that.
Good deal. Thank you, Jody.
I don't know that I even want to say anything.
Yeah, really.
So I put together is just basic some slide information here to give you kind of a real broad overview of data-driven justice, what it is, how we got involved, and kind of what we're looking to do with it. There's 3 of us here locally in Johnson County that are working on the Data-Driven Justice Initiative. Jessica Peckover from the Johnson County Sheriff's Office, Chrissy Canganelli from Shelter House, and me. And in a little bit, I'll kind of explain how the 3 of us got involved. It kind of started back with part of the low barrier shelter, that winter shelter we've done for the last 3 years. One of the projects I worked on was tracking the number of people that came in, unique individuals, and then how our calls for service at the Iowa City Police Department changed as that shelter was going in place. And one of the things we saw was over those 3 years, a 60 to 70% decrease in the vagrancy type calls during those shelter hours, because we no longer had people seeking shelter in apartment buildings, in parking garages, in city stairwells, or other places where they draw negative attention. People call the police department and ask to have them removed. As we saw a significant decrease in those calls for service. And so after the 3rd year, or the 2nd year, started looking at that more and seeing what other data do we have on positive effects we've seen from that. And I started to look at the public intox information to see a lot of these guys are getting arrested for public intox when they're non-cooperative, when they're passed out, et cetera. And so the kind of question was, how is that low barrier shelter affecting those numbers as well? And when I started looking into the data, I was kind of looking at it in different ways. And one of the things I did was graph the age of the person at the time of arrest over that 2.5 year period I was looking at. And one thing I noticed is that that bottom line kind of looks like a dark orange up here. That's only a partial year, so that's why it's a much lower line than the others. But the trend was pretty much the same across those 3 years. The other thing I noticed was that high number of arrests in that 20 to 29 age range. And as I looked into that further, I broke it down by year, and so this is the number of arrests for each age group at the time of arrest. And so by looking at that, we had 27% of our intox arrests were people who were not even legally old enough to drink at the time of their arrest. Expand that out to our college age range, that 18 to 24 demographic, and that's 54.3%. So more than half of our intox arrests are that college age group. And this kind of falls into data-driven justice, because what's important is when we bring this data together, I was given this advice a long time ago of let the data tell the story. You can go in looking for one thing, but be open to other things. I went into this data set looking to see how the winter shelter impacted our public intox arrests of a group that is traditionally 50 to 59 years old. And really, that was a very small segment of our public intox arrests. Kind of the real story here seemed to be how many of our college-age residents are being arrested for this. Around the same time, we had started looking at ways to address a number of homeless issues. The council at the time passed some ordinances to help control some issues in the downtown. Local advocates put together the local homeless coordinating board and started looking at what are some other more positive steps we can take to address these problems, and one was a housing first option. And we needed to look at how can we gather up some real data to support the need for that housing first option. And I'll kind of gloss over this because I think you guys have seen this plenty of times. But the idea is identify those people constantly rotating in and out of emergency rooms, jail, ambulance services, police, but they're seeing no long-term positive effects from dealing with all those services, and how can we focus services on them for an actual positive impact on them. And so we studied 4 people here in Iowa City. The study went just over 4 years of time that we looked at. We got releases from them to get medical information and such. And those 4 individuals used $2.16 million in our local services over just over a 4-year period. And at the end of that 4 years, they were all still living right here. And this is a photo of under the Gilbert Street Bridge. So after 4 years and $2.16 million, they were still homeless. They still had substance abuse issues. So those individuals and our area basically got nothing for all of that time. As a side note, 2 of the individuals we studied have since died while still homeless and as part of their substance abuse issues since we completed this study. So Data-Driven Justice somehow learned about this Johnson County information and data from our presentation and news articles, and Chrissy Canganelli got an invitation to have our local group come out to this White House Data-Driven Justice Initiative last year. The 2 women you see on the right are Kelly Jin and Lynn Overman. They were senior advisors in the Obama White House, and Data-Driven Justice is their baby. They started it there, and of course, they started it just a year before the end, and when Obama transferred out, the question was, where is this going to go? How are we going to keep data-driven justice moving? So the point of this slide is to show that the Laura and John Arnold Foundation were very interested in data-driven justice. They took Kelly and Lynn on, and they're now providing the funding to keep data-driven justice going. So Kelly and Lynn are still both in charge of it, and it was kind of seamless for all of us jurisdictions working on data-driven justice. It's just new email addresses for them, and we're working with the same people. They have partnered with Matthew here, who has Open Lattice, and Open Lattice is kind of the official online platform for data-driven justice. So when we talk about integrating data, it's basically taking data out of our local systems, putting it into a cloud service that provides us the security and tools we need to merge and analyze data, and I'll go over that in a minute. But this is an online platform being developed specifically for DDJ, paid for by the Arnold Foundation, and provided to jurisdictions free of charge. So we've been using this for a number of months now, and it costs us nothing. It's completely free to jurisdictions. When you go into the website, you have these different data sets. Now for us, we'll have police call for service data. Tomorrow, we're actually starting to implement an on-site integration with the Joint Emergency Communication Center, where every 15 minutes, calls for service from Johnson County will automatically be uploaded into the Open Lattice. So we'll have almost live data for analysis up in the Open Lattice platform. We also have Johnson County jail data in there right now, more than 10 years of jail data. And we're working with a number of other providers, HMIS for the shelter information, University of Iowa hospitals to try and get emergency room. I've been meeting recently with the Iowa Health Information Network, which is the health information exchange for Iowa, and I just met with one of their people today about going in at that level and possibly getting just state-level health information exchange into Open Lattice, so that rather than us and every other jurisdiction in Iowa having to negotiate individually with each hospital, we would be pulling data from the health information exchange as a member, and there would no longer be that need to go around and negotiate the compliance issues in that with each hospital individually. One of the neat things about the Open Lattice platform is kind of the time savings. So we had literally hundreds of hours into the study to find that 2.16 million, because I did police information, and then it went over and somebody had to do jail information, and University of Iowa hospitals had to study those individuals, and all these people had to get their data, put it together, and then kind of figure it out. So there were a lot of Excel spreadsheets getting emailed around, and a lot of manual calculations going on. Now in here, when you look at a data set, you can just go in here and click on that, up there they call it Find Top Utilizers, and within a few seconds it pulls up that information that it took us hundreds of hours to get. They're leveraging the cloud computing platform to do all of that work behind the scenes. So once that data is integrated, if you wanted to study how do people's interaction with police go down when they get into shelter house. We can take shelter data, we can take police calls for service data, merge them together, and then all of a sudden we have all the information that we need. Another tool they have is to de-identify data sets. So if we take protected data, let's say emergency room data, mental health treatment data, and police call for service data, we can go into the platform here, merge all those data sets together, and export out de-identified information that can be supplied to a third party, for example, the university or another academic institution for analysis. That's kind of what I got, and I'm open to any questions you might have.
Well, you went through it pretty quickly. And
I was told to keep it quick.
yeah, well, thanks for doing that. What's next?
Next is kind of continuing to work. This health information exchange is a big one. We here in Johnson County, we were the first ones to get data into the official online, into that official Open Lattice platform. We are further along, so it's continuing to push ahead and keep kind of at the forefront of this. There is not a single public hospital that is a participant in data-driven justice now, simply because there's this hesitation to be the first. And this is where the Iowa Health Information Network is going to hopefully be very important, because at that level, they're very excited about this, and they're willing to handle and deal with the legal and compliance issues at their end. So at that point, it becomes we no longer negotiate with all these compliance officers. We just go right to the information exchange, and they handle all that for the hospital. So next is focusing on that. And then kind of working our way down those service providers. We have meetings coming up with HMIS to get shelter information. We have an agreement with Johnson County Department of Public Health to get ambulance data in. And it's just the time-consuming process of doing the meetings to convince people of the need and satisfy the compliance issues. And I think it's kind of one of those, as the first domino falls, it'll be much easier. The police call for service and jail data was fairly simple. It was just the technology hurdles, only because we're only putting publicly available information in anyway. Any CJIS information was scrubbed from that before it was sent up into the cloud. So once we get that first hospital or that first health information exchange, it makes the next state or the next jurisdiction that much better. So it's just kind of continuing to whittle away at those concerns and compliance issues and convince people it's secure and safe to do.
Who's analyzing the data, and what kind of analysis are they using?
Right now, no one is analyzing the data. We haven't taken that step. I recently communicated with Dr. Brook, who came in and did a presentation with to the police department and police officers about getting the College of Public Health involved and what their interest may be in looking at this data and studying it for whatever specific purpose, or to just get in and look at the data and see what they can learn from it. Other than that, we're just kind of looking at what are the possibilities. Right now, we're still at that step of let's get the data in there and find out, kind of cover those hurdles, and then from there, you know, if you take an agency and put their data in, and we'll just use, for example, Shelter House. That's Shelter House's data even once it's in here. So I can't go in and do anything with Shelter House's data without their permission. I have to explicitly request permission. So any agency that puts their data in there still has full control over who has access to it and how they're analyzing it with. And so data sharing agreements will need to be put in place for that, but that can't happen really until the data gets up there to be used.
I think one of and I think as all you recall, I'm sitting on the steering committee for the Access Center. I think one of the most important things is we are talking with other organizations, and I think as people are looking at potential grants, one of the things they're asking for is, well, how are you going to measure the effect of the Access Center? So why should we give you money? Well, you can't measure the success unless we have some baseline data. So what this is going to allow us to do is at least start getting that data in there so we can start getting some baseline data. And as Officer Schwent said, I mean, hundreds of hours, virtually all of them his, on his own time, as I understand, or a lot of it, generated that first set of data that showed those 4 individuals who used basically $2.1 million worth of services over those 4 years. By getting all of these organizations to agree to put data in here, and I've sat in a meeting with Matthew, and his computer didn't work as well as he wanted that day, but literally within 30 seconds or even 5 minutes, they can go through just reams and reams and reams of data and kind of give you whatever information you want. So it'll be easy, or certainly easy, much, much easier to get that baseline data. And then, assuming that the jurisdictions do come together and fund and open some sort of an access center with lots of different purposes, it will allow us then to actually continue to analyze that data and actually show, hopefully, the improvement and the effect of having that kind of a resource available. You know, the decrease in calls for intox. You know, one of the goals obviously is people who are chronically homeless who end up here, trying to gradually get them connected with social workers or caseworkers who might get them services that they are currently resistant to. All different kinds of things. The idea of the Iowa Health Network, getting them on board, as Officer Schwent is saying, is huge, because as I've sat in these meetings, that's one of the things that people have talked about is all of these medical people, whether it's at the hospital or any other kind of health service, they are incredibly, incredibly concerned about confidentiality and their legal liability of where their data goes. And so if we can kind of get it from the top down that says, hey, we're gonna take on that responsibility and we're gonna okay it, that might open the floodgates for some data. So that would be very positive.
Officer, I'm glad that Susan brought up that issue of the $2.4 million for 4 individuals over the course of 4 years. That data is consistent with what we find nationally. It's my understanding that the homeless population that's chronically homeless does consume that amount of resources. I keep on thinking of the article $1 Million Murray by Malcolm Gladwell. It's available on New Yorker for free. You can just Google it and find it, and it basically articulates that there's a convergence, I think, on this issue that we can save money by investing a small amount of those funds to reduce the services that they ultimately will all have to pay for. And what I'm wondering is it too early for us to project, once we go where we want to go in terms of the Access Center and other public policy issues like Housing First, what sort of reduction we hope to achieve in terms of that public expenditure on the chronically homeless population in the emergency room, jails, legal expenses, those sorts of things? Do we have a sense of what we can actually save?
I don't know if anybody's taken numbers from other areas that have implemented that and kind of measured that against our population and our service costs here. I know, for example, the Housing First, first year, they were looking at 60% to 70% reductions in system usage in the first year of housing. And but as far as a larger access center, I don't know that anybody's done that analysis.
Too early. Okay.
One of the challenges, Rockne, that we've talked about at the steering committee is you can't necessarily equate the reduced cost of an individual who, say, no longer ends up in jail for 5 nights or 10 nights a year, or no longer visits the emergency room 20 times. You can't equate the cost of those services if they no longer need them to actual savings, because some of those costs have to do with police officers' time. you're not necessarily going to reduce our police staffing simply because of that. You're not necessarily going to simply reduce the staffing in the jail because of that. You're not necessarily going to automatically reduce staffing in an emergency room. So it's hard because it's not a one-to-one savings. If you pull those 4 individuals out of the system, you don't necessarily save that full $2 million. So it's complicated to calculate, and I don't think anybody has a perfect way of calculating it yet.
I think more what you'll see is, you know, you'll see fewer people with those negative interactions on the street of being intoxicated and passed out somewhere, or just trying to seek shelter in the winter and generating calls for service, maybe going to jail because they were aggravated, because they were cold and tired when the police interacted with them and, you know, got into a physical encounter. You'll see those people not being in the waiting rooms is going to be people not tying up beds in an emergency room and maybe allowing other people to get quicker treatment going through an emergency room because they've been diverted someplace else to prevent those issues. So I think you'll see more of those types of issues than the actual dollar savings.
So Dave, thanks for the review. You're doing great work. You, Jessica, and Chrissy are doing great work. Keep it up, full speed ahead. We look forward to hearing more. But, I mean, I'm going to have to cut you off a little bit because, you know, we've got to be respectful for other people who have to make presentations and stuff like that. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we can turn to our next topic. It's a presentation on the form-based code final report. John?
Good evening.
Good evening.
Dan Perolik and his firm Opticos have been working in Iowa City for the past 8 months, conducting an analysis of the North Side and the South District. Opticos are leading experts in zoning and form-based code techniques. The full report is in your information packet this week. Tonight, Dan will present a summary of the findings and take questions. With that, I'd like to introduce Dan Perolik.
Thanks. Good evening, Dan. I'm going to step out for just a second to get something, but go ahead and start talking.
Good evening, Mayor, and good evening, Council. Let me get this. Well, so as we worked through this process, as John mentioned, we've been working for about 8 months now, and that 8 months always goes by very quickly. It became very evident that this process that we're making recommendations for in terms of assessing form-based code application and enabling missing middle was a lot about sharpening the points of a pencil or a series of pencils, because there's been a tremendous amount of really good planning work, really good policy work, really good coding work that's happened over the course of the last 10 plus years, that the more we dove into it and worked with staff, the more we realized that there's a lot of good content here that really just needs to be taken across the finish line and that point sharpened. So that's always really good to find out and to really see the quality work that was done. Just a quick overview of my presentation. It's pretty straightforward, just a really short introduction to the 2 different planning areas, the North Side and the South District. Then jumping really directly into what our recommendations are for the North Side, overview of that, an overview of the recommendations for the South District, and then just some initial thoughts on next steps so that you guys can start thinking about that as well. And just a quick overview of the process. 8 months, as John mentioned. We were out here for our first trip in February as a core part of the process that we called understanding. It's really where we as a consultant sort of dive in head first, get to understand sort of the background, the history, the context, the issues, the politics of the place, and get up to speed really quickly. And a big part of that was the stakeholder interviews we did over the course of a couple of days. The second phase, through the course of April, May, June, and July, was our exploring, and that entailed a trip in May, a trip where our project manager, John Mickey, came out in July, and this trip here in this presentation. And the final phase is just consolidating these recommendations into the document that we have drafted to date and making a final set of recommendations based on some input on our initial recommendations. So just introduction, right? I think most of you are pretty aware of the boundaries, but to just give you a sense of the north side project area, it starts just north of Brown Street. The southern edge is Jefferson. The western edge is Clinton, and the eastern edge is Governor Street. So it's a pretty large area, obviously a really fantastic, compact, pre-1940s walkable neighborhood. And it was a real pleasure sort of continuing to learn about this neighborhood and how it functions. Then jumping to the South District, and obviously a very different type of project area, but it's really an interesting and a fun challenge to look at these two different types of places. But a fairly large area bounded on the western side by, sorry, I just totally drew a blank. I must be really tired. The name of the street on the Ogilvy.
On the western side?
Western edge.
Yeah, Sand Road,
Sand
South
Road.
Governor Street.
Sorry, I must be really tired from a series of meetings today. Sort of working its way down on the southern edge by Lower Sycamore, and then down to the soccer fields on the southern edge, and then on the far eastern side, it actually goes to the Greenway, just a little beyond the Greenway, and then the upper edge goes just up to the Governor's Park, the little park that's up in that corner. Weatherby Park. Sorry, I apologize. Must be a little bit tired here. So two really interesting project areas, two very different, sort of both physically, the challenges and the opportunities in those areas. So obviously needing to think about form-based code application in both of these areas and what similar features, similar approaches, and unique features to the process would each of these project areas would we recommend for these areas. And so just a quick overview in terms of what the goals are for the north side. I think, once again, there's been years and years of planning and coding that has happened and really done a really good job to date in preserving and maintaining the quality of this neighborhood. And part of this is about, continuing to improve housing options throughout the area, sort of maintaining a level of stability, maybe even thinking about increasing home ownership if there's some strategies to do that in this area. Preserving the historic character, right? It's got a really unique, charming, sort of late 1800s, early 1900s character that a strong effort has been made to protect that, really high quality, and sort of just continuing those efforts. And then obviously, as every great place has, parking concerns and parking issues, and just making sure as this process moves forward that we're hearing and understanding the issues, addressing those issues both in the planning and the new form-based code pieces that get adopted for this and applied to this area. Basically, what became really apparent is that the north side marketplace is the one area at the southern edge of the north side project planning area that has some of the largest opportunities and potentially some of the biggest concerns because of some of those opportunities and sort of gaps to fill. And so basically thinking about the future of filling in some of those gaps in the north side marketplace as a strategy for the future. Just simply thinking very big picture about how can we improve walkability, right? There's a high level of walkability, really high walk score, but how can we, as we do some planning and code writing, think about what sorts of improvements can we do to make it even better over the course of the next short and the midterm. And then the last one is just simply thinking about predictability and how can we put a process and a set of new regulations in place that actually lead to predictability. And we like to say predictability both for developers who want to come in and do the right thing and meet the sort of the objectives of the planning and the code, as well as predictability for community members who are really concerned about their community and their neighborhood. So that's a really important part of this. The north side area is composed of 3 historic districts, and what's really interesting about that is as we dove deeper into that and sort of did some mapping in terms of contributing structures, the key contributing structures, non-contributing, it became really evident that in these 3 historic districts that 90+% of the lots in these historic districts are either contributing or these key contributing features. So number one that says is we need to make an effort in here to continue to protect those really important historic resources. But the other thing we need to be thinking about is, you know, what can we do to sort of think about those non-contributing lots? What are the futures of those, even though there's only a few of them, to make sure that as sort of reinvestment happens in those, that it is reinforcing the quality and character of this North Side neighborhood. So I just wanted to zoom in on these a little bit to show you, this is just the northern edge, sort of near surrounding Brown Street, to show you, you know, it's only the sites that are in gray and in the hatched ones that are not contributing or key contributing. So, right, there's very few of those, especially in that northern side. As you move your way down and look at sort of just south of Church Street, there's just a few more of those site lots that aren't contributing or key contributing, but still, you know, 80+% that, you know, the goal is simply maintain and preserve the quality of those areas. And then as we move down to the southern area, this North Side Marketplace, not in a historic district. This map's a little bit deceiving because there's still there's still landmarks and contributing buildings in there, but it's not in a historic district. It just need to be very carefully thought about. A lot more gaps and opportunities in that area. Part of that sort of is the balance of the charm of the area and sort of the neighborhood scale of it. Feels more like a neighborhood sort of main street than a downtown. So thinking about that scale and how the ultimate plan and coding can reinforce that intent of the North Side Marketplace. So the first recommendation, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, and feel free to ask questions as I go, or you can hold your questions till afterwards. But the first one was just simply integrating the intent of the central district plan into new form-based code or form-based zones. And what became really apparent is the planning work that was fairly recently done on the central district plan is a really great foundation. It just was never fully implemented from a regulatory standpoint. So it's like taking that next step of that really good intent, and instead of making a developer, the staff that's trying to administer a project, go both in the zoning and into the central district plan and trying to understand that intent, let's just collapse all that really good intent into a new set of regulations or form-based zoning districts. So that's our first recommendation. The second recommendation is, once again, just thinking about the intent of the historic districts and all the standards that reinforce the historic district. And once again, it's taking as much of that really good content and those regulations as is possible and compressing that down into one unified system, because the fewer layers you have, the more easy that system and that form-based code will be to understand, and the more easy it will be to administer, and the easier it will be even for developers to understand what the goals and objectives are for that area. And so examples like we've acknowledged that you could think about larger rear setbacks, because the pattern in these neighborhoods, these 150-foot deep lots, are actually pretty substantial, typically large backyards. Sometimes those buildings are sort of encroaching into that large setback, and they start to fill out of place and out of scale with those neighborhoods. So those are the sorts of fine tunes we can do. And then just thinking about overall width and depth of the buildings. What we find with a lot of conventional zoning is that, you know, if the lot stays small, the building will stay small, but at the point at which a lot starts getting bigger, there's no standards to actually prevent the building from getting bigger. So we think very carefully about, well, what is the appropriate maximum width and depth of a building, and we just directly regulate that. And it's very carefully assessed through different lot sizes as we go through this process. The third recommendation is just simply getting back to this idea of the missing middle housing, the duplex, the fourplex, the cottage court, these house scale buildings that happen to have multiple units, and how can we go through a process and write a code that can enable the missing middle housing where it's appropriate in the north side planning area. And so part of this is thinking and just being very cognizant of where we have historic landmark buildings and contributing buildings, and acknowledging that we're not putting a process in place to potentially harm or jeopardize the protection of those historic attributes and those historic buildings. It's simply looking at those opportunities that aren't contributing, and even more likely putting a system in place that actually could apply in other pre-1940s walkable neighborhoods, maybe to the east of the planning area. You know, as we put the system in place, the planning staff can assess and the council could assess where else within the larger Iowa City context that you all might be able to apply, sort of enforce and reinforce the notion of integrating missing middle housing. The other thing is that just thinking very carefully about this form-based approach to zoning, and a lot of this, especially related to these types of neighborhoods and missing middle housing, is simply getting back to ensuring a house scale building, right? Even if it might happen to have multiple units in it, it inevitably still stays the scale that is compatible with a single family home. So that's a really important part of the concept as we think about this. It's also a really important part of this as you jump into phase 2, that you have a multidisciplinary team on board, and an important part of that is an economist that can actually, as planning is being done, as the form-based code is being written, that you can actually test the economic viability of the concepts, especially of these missing middle housing types, because it doesn't make any sense to sort of go through this exercise and propose ideas that haven't been economically vetted and won't actually, maybe they're not viable in the short term, but viable in the longer term. And the last thing I want to mention is that, with the new state occupancy legislation, the staff in the short term is going to be putting some really quick fixes in place to address the new occupancy legislation that will take place, or sort of kick in January. But as you go through the phase 2 of this process, there'll be more carefully crafted and integrated set of regulations that will effectively address that occupancy. And I'll say that's a real challenge, because Iowa is the first state to actually adopt this sort of legislation, or at least the first state we've worked in. And but those thoughts will be very carefully integrated into the coding process as it moves into phase 2. As I mentioned earlier, Northside Marketplace, in a lot of ways, is the lowest hanging fruit, probably the best opportunity, and the maybe the one that makes the most sense to focus on in the short term if you need to prioritize, based on recent pressures, project applications, new projects that have been built there, growing neighborhood concerns. But we're recommending that as part of the form-based strategy, that the city first does a more detailed vision and a plan for the Northside Marketplace area that then the form-based code can implement. And so the first step would be that visioning process. And that visioning process, we're recommending a multi-day design charrette. And it sounds like most of you are probably familiar with that process. Maybe you've done that a handful of times, including, I think, the Riverfront Crossings probably, but where this multidisciplinary design team sets up a design studio, ideally on site or in the project area. They're here 3, 4, 5 days, depending on sort of what is determined as the right amount of time. And the team goes through a series of feedback loops. And so major stakeholders are brought in, community members are brought in. They can participate in formal ways. There's sort of a formal kickoff presentation, midpoint presentation, and closing presentation. Those are the formal ways to participate. Through the course of those several days, the studio's open for most of the day, usually from about 9 o'clock till about 5 o'clock. Except for the last half day where we're sort of putting our heads down and sort of actually producing content. There's typically brown bag lunches where they're topic specific. It might be street design, it might be form-based coding, it might be missing middle housing, where people can come in and participate and sort of learn about specific aspects of this project as they are interested. The other thing is, this is just a continuous way to continue a really robust and broad public outreach through this process in terms of using this multi-day charrette process. And what I like most about this process is it's not just simply about getting together and talking and writing on big Post-it notes and gathering comments. It's actually about testing design options. So pick a site, steady 1-story, 2-story, 3-story, 5-story, 6-story? What does it look like with ground floor retail? Could it just be all residential? And actually put those up and talk about them. And over the course of those several days, you're getting sort of feedback loops and sort of, I love that, I hate that, I kind of like that, but could you try this? And so the team's continuously evolving those ideas and concepts and testing them over the course of those several days. Some really specific recommendations, sort of making some adjustments to impervious cover requirements, right? I'm sure you noticed as you walk around Northside, some of those beautiful lush backyards have gotten paved over and are big parking lots. And part of the idea is that's obviously not healthy for a neighborhood, of thinking about ways to reduce the impact of simple paving in the backyards, and that's going to be tied into the larger strategy. I'm thinking about developing a series of pre-approved ancillary unit plans so that it would ease the process of getting an ancillary unit entitled and built. And I know that this is only one, sort of timing is only one of the obstacles. Cost of construction sounds like is another one of those, but we feel that this could, in targeted areas, actually be a really great tool to enable more housing choices and appropriate scaled housing to infill to happen in this Northside planning area. Improving walkability and public safety, right? We heard a lot about sort of that it's just really dark when you're walking through the Northside area after the sun goes down, both unsafe from a standpoint of muggings. I think there's a pretty large number of muggings that happen, as well as just somebody tripping over where a sidewalk has been sort of raised by a tree root. And so, I know that the city has been working on some of this, just continuing to reinforce those efforts about increasing the quality of the walkability. And then transportation and parking, right? Once again, parking, always a hot topic. We're actually recommending that to consider allowing on-street parking on both sides of the streets. In the Northside District, the real benefit of doing this as a starting point is that we feel that it will dramatically reduce the speed of traffic as it goes through the neighborhoods and increase safety. I know we talked with a lot of different community members about potential fixes to getting cars to drive slower with little traffic circles and obstacles in the medians. The much easier thing to do is just allow the parking to happen on the sides, and then people will slow down just because there's a perceived sort of squeezing and tightening of the street design. And if you were to implement that, one of the things to keep in mind that we're recommending is just keep a constant sort of assessment of the need for a potential parking permit district or a parking permit system. We usually recommend like every year to year and a half that it's assessed whether or not a parking permit system would want to be put in place to help with turnover of cars, preventing people from parking there and going to the university and such. So just highly recommend that as well. And then the last sort of transportation-related recommendation is just one that we've heard many times, and we think it's actually moving forward in the city already, but we just want to reinforce that push to actually consider converting the one-way streets back to two-ways in terms of improving livability and walkability in the Northside neighborhood. Last recommendation for Northside is looking at developing a missing middle pilot project. And the last presentations, we talked about the 724 Ronald Street lot that the city owns, thinking about that site as a potential cottage court, a fourplex, and basically proving in this market that the missing middle will perform financially. I think that could be a really great way to plant some seeds of some really high quality, diverse housing choices in the Northside District in particular. So South District. Right, some really broad overarching goals here as a starting point. Once again, really great work done on the South District plan. Just really great foundation. One of the ideas is just reinforcing this concept of neighborhood nodes, which makes a neighborhood walkable. What is a node? It might be a small neighborhood main street like a Lynn Street, right? 1, 2, 3-story buildings with ground floor commercial cafes and such. It might simply be a park or a green space as a node. It might be where you change the building type. So all of a sudden at a node you get row houses as opposed to a single family detached, and it sort of defines a different character. So thinking about this hierarchy of nodes is an important part of moving forward with implementing this plan and reinforcing it with the form-based code, expanding the really fantastic open space network and trails network that already exists out there, and sort of make that permeable through the project area would be a really important priority. And then once again, thinking about housing options and housing choices throughout this area. Missing middle housing, duplexes, fourplexes, townhouses, small lot, single family, to put together to compose these diverse walkable neighborhoods. Improving connectivity, street network, thinking about an integral street network, thinking about the design of the streets, just generally improving walkability. And then I'll talk about this in introducing new set of development standards to effectively implement a series of walkable neighborhoods. And when we've done this before in other communities, we've called it a traditional neighborhood development ordinance. Some communities have called it a new walkable community ordinance. You can call it whatever you want. It has a similar set of tools where you actually define a street network. You define an open space network. You define a series of form-based zones that one might be neighborhood Main Street, the other might be missing middle housing, the other might be a mix of missing middle and small lot single family, that are give you the kit of parts that are necessary to effectively implement a walkable neighborhood in this South District planning area. Once again, we're recommending for this area as well that we feel that a multi-day design charrette is a really great approach for this project, because we can bring different stakeholders, property owners, community members, different builders, developers that may be the ones that end up developing the site to the table, and talk about different potential build out that in ways that meet the intent of the Central District Plan and the new vision. And then what's interesting about this approach is that not only do you have the new form-based zone districts mapped, but I think you did this in the Northwest, the riverfront crossings, is that you also have a specific set or palette of street types mapped. So we've flushed out a set of walkable pedestrian-oriented street types that get mapped through the course of this process. This diverse palette of form-based zoning districts. Main Street, missing middle or walkable neighborhood, mix of housing types, approaching this from a community character and a form standpoint, as opposed to a use-based or a density-based system. And, you know, we're sort of still trying to figure this out, but we're thinking about, once again, recommending potentially introducing a set of pre-approved missing middle housing plans and housing designs that would further enable sort of the implementation of missing middle in the South District. Developers that are a little sort of leery of this or sort of have cost limitations, like this would be a really good way to give them a set of pre-approved plans that they can latch onto and sort of implement more effectively. This is just a really great diagram that shows this concept of a series of different nodes along McAllister. And we know that McAllister likely will be the first of the thoroughfares of the streets that gets built through the site. It's really, really critical that the design of this street gets done in a way that sort of takes into this account of the pedestrian and walkable nature of the desired neighborhood or series of neighborhoods. And I think, if the street gets built in a way that doesn't take that into account, it sort of start off on a losing footing. So we're thinking very carefully about that. How do streets connect through the site? And how do they connect to that McAllister Boulevard extension? And so, this is just one potential scenario of reinforcing this idea of a really connected street network. The likelihood as you go through this charrette process that will be refined based on the types of buildings that you're trying to place in those streets and blocks. But this is just reinforcing that idea that even McAllister Street, as a really strong connector to larger parts of the city, has a lot of neighborhood streets connecting to it. Now, some of them might only be right in or right out. You don't want to actually have a lot of stops along that street, but thinking about reinforcing this idea of walkability and connectivity in all aspects of the plan. So next steps, we'll be meeting with the city staff over the course of the next couple of weeks, getting feedback from you all to finalize the recommendations report. Now, that will be done fairly quickly. And then really it's up to you all and the city to prioritize implementation and sort of what are the steps for implementation. And there's really 4 primary pieces here that we feel that kind of the decision can be made about. The first one is this recommendation for this multi-day charrette process, both for the north side and the south district. And do you all feel that that's a good idea and a good process moving forward to sort of put that detailed vision plan in place that the code would reinforce? The second one is just thinking about form-based code application for both north side and as well as the south district. And what's interesting about this way we've done this in the past is we recommend putting a structure and a shared system in place so that they're one form-based code that can be applied to those 2 different areas so that the staff's not trying to administer, you're not trying to look at multiple documents. And even what's working in your current riverfront crossings code, we need to look very carefully at that in terms of what can we share, lessons learned we can plug into the new form-based code process. Integrating the new standards within your existing zoning code, really careful thought into how do these new standards plug in, replace, supplement the existing standards, the existing processes, how they're administered. And then, once again, identifying demonstration projects. Ronald Street is kind of low-hanging fruit in terms of one that's been looked at. There's actually several other opportunities that even came up in conversations today with some of the developers in your community are actually interested in saying, well, what if I don't want to wait for that big South District plan and I want to try missing middle across the street? Like, would you be open to working with us to make that happen? So that's really exciting, and I think those are the types of opportunities that you should latch onto and take advantage of. And even other opportunities in the downtown where properties are turning over, and there might be opportunities to look at missing middle or sort of this middle scale infill. So those are a series of our recommendations. I know that was a lot in a fairly short amount of time. I'm happy to answer questions, but once again, the further we dove into this, the more we realize that there's a really good foundation here. And it's also a really good foundation in terms of that we have a community here that's familiar with that charrette process, that multi-day process. So it's not something new, it's not scary, it's been effective already, so we can kind of latch on to and learn from that as well. And think about what this really is form-based. We were talking about this today. Form-based coding has actually advanced substantially in the past 10 years. It's over 30 years old, but in the past 10 years in particular, it's advanced very rapidly. And we feel very strongly for both the north side and the south district that it would be a really effective tool for ensuring high-quality, long-term implementation of these goals that the city's put in place over the course of the last 10-plus years.
Okay, excellent overview, Dan. Thank you very much. I'm guessing that people have a variety of questions to ask and also responses to provide. And it's really important that we do that because you need guidance, but more importantly, our staff needs guidance about whether we want to proceed. Basically, that's the starting point question. And then whether there are particular aspects of your preliminary report that we really like or maybe are troubled by or whatever. So I'll just make one real quick comment. I definitely think we should proceed. I think there's great potential associated with the form-based code approach to both the North Side neighborhood and to the South District area. And I note in reading your draft report that there's ample opportunity, should we choose to take it, to extend the form-based code work to other neighborhoods that would benefit from it. I think in part about Manville Heights, for example. And everybody at the table and in the audience probably knows there's a huge adverse response to a proposed building in Manville Heights that was permitted by existing code. And then that played out in the courts and so on. And I think a form-based code would help us avoid those kinds of problems in the future in neighborhoods like Manville Heights. So anyhow, I don't want to talk too much right at the start. I just want to express my general point of view and then see if you folks have questions you want to ask, reactions you want to provide to Dan, and so on.
I really liked your concept of the pre-approved plans for auxiliary dwelling units. In the presentation I went to 3 weeks ago, one of the responses from the audience was, does the pre-approved plan mean that does not mean that you can't do another type of design if you choose to hire your own designer to do that? The thought being that these are the suggestions, and that if you adopt these, you pretty much know that it's going to be pre-approved. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. If a property owner decides they don't want that specific design or picking from the several designs that are pre-approved, they can choose a different design or have their architect to do a different design. But it would just, the purpose is to streamline approval as quickly as possible with the pre-approved one. So there would just be a little bit more review. Now it's not a complicated or a large building, so but you need to think very carefully about then what is the trigger if you don't use those pre-approved ones, as opposed to what's your process if you do choose the pre-approved plans.
One quick follow-up. I really liked your concept of the parking permit system. I was wondering whether you could elaborate about what type of system you could imagine. Could you do that?
Yeah, and what I would say is we have a transportation consultant on the team. I'm not an expert, but I will try to. We do this in a lot of different projects that we work on, and the idea is that you can do it a number of different ways, but the residents of the neighborhood sometimes are given free permits. Sometimes everybody buys a permit, but the idea is that if you don't have a permit, you can usually only park in that area for a limited amount of time, maybe 2 hours, maybe 3 hours. And if you don't move your car after that amount of time, you get a ticket. And so what that does is it prevents somebody from parking there and walking to downtown to work, or walking to college, to school, to classes, and leaving their car there for 12 hours. And it provides the turnover and enables there to be more parking available for the people who actually live in the neighborhood.
If I could, a follow up on Rockney's first question, which has to do with control of design, basically. So in a recent public presentation, one of our prominent business owners spoke very negatively about a form-based code if it was going to be applied to the downtown. Now, I don't want to open up that door at the moment, but his concern had to do with his perceived control over design. He wanted to make, if I understood him correctly, he wanted to make sure that owners would have flexibility and be able to be creative about what they could do with their buildings and so on. So am I right in understanding that form-based code does not strictly limit what a person can do with a particular piece of property, but it does provide guidance about the mass and scale and height and a few things like that of a building that could go into a site. Can you help me?
Yeah, particularly to a downtown context. Number one is a form-based code does not inherently regulate architectural style. If a city decides to put other architectural design standards on top of it, they can. For a downtown, most don't. But what the form-based code does is there's specific elements and characteristics that actually create a good urban building. And you know the frontage, like how does a building address the sidewalk? And there's just some really basic parameters. It doesn't have to be overly complicated that we usually put into a form-based code for a downtown that say, here's a series of 3 or 4 really basic things that your ground floor, your characteristic that your ground floor has to have to actually be a well-behaving urban building. And what we talk about is like the building from the knees down is actually really important to think about. And so the form-based code does sort of give some really basic parameters, but there's a lot of variety and options that an architect can, different approaches they can use to achieve those end objectives. It's quite a bit of flexibility.
I thought that was the case, but Susan, John, Pauline?
Yeah, I'd certainly supportive of the work, and as your presentation reflected, it's covered a lot of ground in 2 different areas at different scales of proposals. But I would say overall I'm pleased with the outcome in both areas. I would agree that Northside Marketplace, I think, is the one that may require more detailed consideration. But I've felt for many years that, you know, a clearer idea of how we, as you had mentioned, take the intent of the Central District Plan and get that intent into a more regulatory framework, because as we've had many discussions on council about, yes, there's the aspiration of the plan, and yet it doesn't necessarily tie into our zoning. So I would like to do that, make that connection. Infill development, the notion of house form versus block form, I thought was an interesting concept. And the notion of how do we, what I've really been struggling with and at the same time interested in trying to understand is how to identify and articulate the next increment of development. I think for the neighborhoods that becomes clearer with the concept of taking the house form and adapting it to different densities in different contexts. The traffic component, I think, is really valuable. The parking benefit aspect of that, I think, is critical, because what we have now is basically free parking, and that's a value that I would like to capture. What's unique, Dan, to at least the north side is that much of the street parking is not utilized by residents. It's used by outsiders. Now, there are some residents who don't have access to off-street parking, so this would also benefit them, because right now they are having trouble even during summer finding parking spaces in certain parts of the north side. Taking Donald Shoup's concept that you take the permit revenues and especially in this case, because so much of it would most likely be outsiders, and take that revenue and apply it towards some of the improvements that were also identified in the plan, I think overcomes what I'm hearing as some of the objections of certain residents who feel that having cars parked on both sides of the street is just too much. You know, it's too urban. I think when you tie it to a benefit to those same residents, they may not be quite as resistant to the idea. And then in the South District, I think we have an opportunity to really reconsider our street design, which I think, as your consultant noted, and we're hearing many complaints from residents in our subdivisions that traffic speeds are too high. So in my view, if we can redesign and reconfigure our streets, most likely narrowing them, that will give us more, not only more calming effect with traffic flow, but also more land with which to develop if we reallocate, take less land for our streets and more for development. So I think there are a lot of opportunities we can take advantage of with this. I was pleased to see in the South District how it looked like the cottage courts were favored by the residents and some of their looking at different housing types. I'm a big fan of cottage courts. I think they're really pretty cool. So yeah, I say we move forward, and you know, it's going to be kind of multifaceted, but I think it's all for the good.
I really liked the vast majority of what I saw, and I'm not going to try and go into detail because I don't think that matters really tonight. I mean, I guess the one I will comment is I like the idea of trying to get some human scale lights in the north side, you know, on those dark sidewalks.
It's mighty dark on many of the
But
streets.
there's a lot of other things I could comment on. I guess with the idea that I was pretty sure everybody here was going to want to move forward, what I would like to focus on at the moment is how do, you know, and this is, a lot of this is going to come back to staff, and I'm not asking for an answer right now, Jeff or Ashley, but time frame and dollar-wise, in terms of what we've already spent, in terms of consultants, what 2 multi-day charrettes would cost for each of these areas, and then paying for the assistance, at least, of the development of the form-based codes, because I say that having gone through all the packets and everything, and not I mean, I heard all of it, but I didn't put it all together, all the things that were mentioned by council in terms of the budget for next year. And when I read it in the packet, I was like, oh my gosh. we got a lot of things that we want to do. And so how do we balance all this? Not only, the work of staff, we've talked about the amount of work that we've been asking staff to do in the last year and a half with the strategic plan. I think these are incredibly important. To me, it's hard to prioritize from the standpoint that we don't want to miss out on opportunities on the north side and let it go further than it already has in terms of bad rentals, if you will, in some cases. On the same token, we don't want to let things get started on the south side that would basically end up being something in the middle that doesn't fit with the rest of what we're trying to develop around it. So I think we've got some real competing priorities here that we're going to have to figure out how to manage. And I guess my thought is to throw that in Jeff's lap.
Yeah, we'll have to follow up on that.
Yeah, and I think maybe I'll need some time. I think we need to figure out our scope before I can really comment on the cost piece.
Sure.
But Dan could probably provide some guidance on the timing, because I'll say it's not going to be cheap and it's not going to be quick.
I know.
But that's not to say it's not worthy of pursuit, because we're talking about our built environment for the next several generations. But
right.
Dan, can you touch on the time frame if you were to tackle the 4 bullet points up there, what you might be looking at?
I think it's likely an 18-month process. I mean, could potentially be done in 12 if, depending on, actually more than anything, sort of staff availability to review drafts and to keep, I know they're working on a bunch of different things, but I would 12 to 18 months, probably closer to 18, just to be conservative about it. And what's nice about it, there's actually some nice efficiencies in doing them together, because you are creating one form-based code that, certain elements are more specific to South District and certain are more specific to our side, but there is some efficiencies in the code writing that you're creating one and not trying to create 2 different systems.
I think from a staffing standpoint, we fully expect that we'd be moving forward with this. I think the intention was we do phase 1, and unless there's some major red flags raised, we would pursue phase 2. I think what we all have to realize, though, is the capacity to layer major planning initiatives on top of this effort and the other things that we have going on. I don't think we have that capacity right now. So whether that's a downtown form-based code or any number of other things we might think of, from a planning staff perspective, this would probably bring us to capacity.
Yeah. So we'll have to have a further conversation about that. Pauline, did you want to add anything?
I just want to say that I was so impressed with the amount of information. You said basically 7-8 months of gathering all of this information that you put together. A lot of detail. And one of the items Susan mentioned, our budget. I had asked about our transit system, and you actually had an item, and I think it was the north side and the south side, about the need for that, different routes and different timing on that. So I was impressed to see that. And then someone else mentioned the survey of the different types of homes, and that was very interesting to see that and see what people preferred, because I like the fourplexes and the cottage type too. So that was good to see.
Yeah, it's interesting. It was actually the first time we did this missing middle board game, housing board game. It was sort of one of our staff members created that concept, and it really engaged the community members. And there's something about the cottage court that I think it's a little bit easier for a lot of people to relate to, because it's the closest to a single family detached house, but it's sort of a community that's being created. But I thought we were really excited about how people responded to that exercise and got some really good feedback from it.
I really like the idea of following through with that particular building on Ronald Street, and the one that we bought, I don't know, a year and a half ago, whatever it was, and using it as a test case. Yeah. Okay, anything else for Dan?
Well, what I would recommend is the that staff put together a scope of work for Phase 2, bring that before you to make sure that you agree with what we're looking at doing, let you provide any comments, and then we have to go through a procurement process from that point. But we'll try to do that fairly soon here, return to you after the plan's finalized and suggest how we move forward and all the recommendations.
Good deal. Dan, thanks for the great work you and your
Thank you.
staff have done, and your colleagues. It's been good seeing you, and I enjoyed our conversation today, too. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, we might be able to do the next element in our work session, which is to discuss clarification of agenda items. Are any topics? Are there any topics you want to address or get some clarification on? I guess I wanted to comment briefly on item 3F2, which is correspondence. It's an email from a man named Frank Williams, and it notes that we plan to spend roughly $6 million on the pedestrian mall. And he was wondering whether we would be spending any money to revitalize the east side of town. All right, so I think it's correct that we are planning to spend approximately $6 million over 2018 and 2019 on the Ped Mall, but we've also, I want to just kind of say this publicly, we've also done a substantial amount of work on the east side that is comparable to the Ped Mall. So I'm thinking in particular about reconstruction of First Avenue and the railroad overpass, as well as reconstruction of Lower Muscatine Road and South Sycamore Street. And there's more, I'm sure, but I don't know the dollar amount. I intended to try to look that up, but it's substantial.
Far more than $6 million.
Yeah. So I think it's completely appropriate that Mr. Williams wrote and asked a completely reasonable question, but we have been investing a lot on the east side.
I did email him.
Oh, good.
And said I'd be happy to meet with him to discuss what his concerns were and what improvements he would like to see, and also make him aware of what the city has done that he may not be as conscious of.
Yeah, okay. Any further clarification about agenda items? We can touch on the info packet for August the 3rd.
Jeff, I just want to ask about, can we get staff to I would like to go to the ICAD annual meeting.
Sure.
RSVP.
Yeah, if anybody's interested.
Anybody else want to? I mean, I've already connected with Kelly about that.
Thank you.
We'll get you registered.
Thank you.
With regard to IP3, it's ICAD happenings or something like that. There's an announcement about Oral-B and about its moving a portion of its electric toothbrush manufacturing unit to the former Menards building on Highway 1. We've known this has been underway, but I think this is the first time we've seen anything in writing about it. So I just want to acknowledge that this is taking place, and it's a pretty big deal. So August 3rd. August 10th?
IP5 and IP6, the Community Rights Movement and the Worker Bill of Rights. I think Kingsley had met with Paul Cienfuego, and when he was in Iowa City, I met with him as well. I don't know, Eleanor, if you're familiar with his work, but it's kind of an interesting concept at any rate, the idea of local municipalities taking greater control over their own destiny. Just wanted to mention that I had met with him, and I find his approach interesting, at the very least.
I went to a meeting that he conducted in the area about time flies, a year and a half or 2 years ago. Found it very interesting. Again, I think kind of looking at what other municipalities have done this and what kind of legal challenges they've had and how successful they have been, I think would be an
Right.
interesting thing to find out.
Right. And I emphasize, too, that his focus was more, it seemed to me, on corporate-related issues. And I mentioned to him that in our experience, at least recently, it's been the state that has been the source of our challenges. But I think the principle is the same.
Yeah, and it's always important to remember that cities are creatures of the state. You know, we don't exist, cities don't exist in the Constitution. So our powers come from the state legislature or the state government. So there are certain things we can do, certain things we can't do, and all that would have to be probed. With regard to pending work session topics, I will want to bring up a suggestion concerning the September 5th meeting, but I don't think we have time to really kind of flesh it out because we're pretty much out of time prior to our formal meeting. So heads up, when we get back together after the formal meeting, I'll suggest a particular topic for September the 5th. Any other topics on that?
I would just want to mention IP9. If people didn't see this in the news, I want to congratulate Chrissy Canganelli and the Shelter House on their $2.7 million award from the Iowa Finance Authority for housing that they're going to construct for the chronically homeless. So great work on their part in getting that grant.
How does that fit with the proposed access center?
It doesn't. I don't think really. This is actually permanent housing for people who are chronically homeless. The Access Center is going to be more temporary detox, those kinds of things.
Okay. It is excellent news, for sure.
Excellent news.
Two quick items, if I could,
Sure.
real quick. I want to call attention to your late handouts. You had an invitation that came in after the deadline for the information packet, but the Housing Trust Fund of Johnson County has invited any one of you to attend its annual meeting. It is in your late handouts, but that's Friday, August 25th from 8:30 to 9:15, and that's at Midwest One's new building on South Clinton in the Riverfront Crossings District. There's an email to RSVP too, or you can just let me know if you plan to attend and we can RSVP for you. And then IP7 is the food truck pilot program evaluation memo that Simon prepared. Based on the experiences, the recommendation is that we amend the code to allow the evening vending. There were no issues, so to speak. I don't think it was necessarily as successful as the vendors would have liked, but that said, we didn't experience any negative feedback from the expansion. So we will move forward with that code amendment absent any comments from council.
Well, my only comment was the one complaint, which was DP Doe. And, my concern would be that little node of commercial seems, is going through a little bit of disruption. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts in terms of monitoring that, but it was something that I was concerned about. As much as I like the Robert A. Lee Center as a place for the food trucks, I am concerned about the sustainability of that commercial area.
Yeah, I don't think we would continue to use that parking lot for the food trucks. We're really just looking at the on-street parking spaces that they have access to during the daytime hours right now, and putting that, making those available in the evening. Okay. We would also not be hooding the meters for this pilot. We actually had staff go in, reserve the spaces, and then check on them and clean up. We're not really staffed to do that on a consistent basis. That is a concern of the vendors because parking is tight, especially in those evening hours. And so for those trucks to find a couple of consecutive spaces to park their vehicles, that will be tough. But I think that's, at least in my view, I think that's fair that they're seeking those spaces along with everybody else that is coming to the downtown or visiting campus, whatever it may be.
Okie doke. So I think we need to stop there. So let's adjourn for now. We'll come back to the work session right after the formal meeting. Pick up at the August 10th packet in IP number 5, which is pending work sessions, and then go through anything else that we need to cover following that. So we're done for right now with regard to our work session. Formal meeting starts at 7 p.m. So with regard to the September 5th work session, the August 10th packet, IP number 5, indicates that we don't have a defined topic for that. So I thought, well, maybe we could do the Lusk Avenue situation because that's on our pending list. But then I thought, no, we really want to have our neighborhood stabilization presentation before we discuss anything having to do with Lusk Avenue. So then I thought, well, then I looked at that long list of items that we recommended as a council concerning the budget, and I thought this is just too much. We should focus more. I strongly believe we need to spend a half hour or more, if we need it, to prioritize our budget suggestions so that the staff will get a set of recommendations that come from at least a majority of the council, maybe unanimous votes from the council, so they get clear instructions instead of not really knowing whether there's only support from one or two individual council members. So I connected with Jeff about this and asked, ran it by him, and he says, yeah, sure, that seems like a pretty reasonable thing to do. But I also asked Jeff if he could help us by, first of all, restructuring the list so that the items appear under the 7 strategic plan priorities, so that we'll have a sense of really what they're trying to get at. And also that the staff indicate whether the individual suggestions would have a low, medium, or high budgetary impact, so that we have a little bit of sense about, be able to make that kind of choice that we have to make, really. We can't just do it willy-nilly, like you made this point last time.
The other thing I would suggest with that, Jim, is what would be the staff time commitment to those things? Because some of them are not just a financial commitment, but if we put the money in the budget and we're trying to do it, we may also be talking about significant staff time. And given how much stuff staff is already loaded up with, I think it's important that we have kind of an understanding. And Jeff, you've got to really tell us if we're overloading staff.
Yeah, that sounds pretty reasonable, doesn't it?
So,
High, medium, low, again, that
Yeah,
kind of thing.
but I would say that that be in kind of conjunction with timeline, because there may be some things that staff are able to take on. It may not necessarily be immediately, but over a course of time, there may be something that could be worked out. And so,
but just, how it can fit in with their workload, I think, needs to be considered as well.
Yeah.
There's no point in budgeting it if staff doesn't have time to do it.
Sure.
So.
Oh, and my last point to add to that, is there any way we can talk about the kind of, and maybe this is going to be somewhat ad hoc or as we kind of discuss it, but just, and maybe this is you or Simon, I know has helped out in the past, but the structure of how we deliberate on it. We only have a finite amount of time, and so I just want to make sure that we're using it effectively. I just don't want to have another, like, kind of budget planning 3-hour session type of thing.
So we'll have to put some thought into that. One thing we need to do is eliminate redundancies, because there's some items that are redundant to others. And then judge which ones really warrant priority and which ones don't. Because they're really of different scales too. Some are fairly small, can be done pretty quickly. Others are kind of big and expected to go on for a year or whatever. So we need that kind of sense too.
And I think there's really 2 types of input that are important for us to hear, particularly in the context of the strategic plan and wanting us to list these under those 7 priorities. First is, if there's a specific project that you want us to accomplish, by all means, tell us. We'll get it in the budget. There may be a domino effect with other projects depending on the magnitude and scope of it, but we would let you know that, and you can reconsider your discussion or your decision if need be. But the other would be if some of those were not well defined, and that's okay. I don't think you need to feel pressured to nail down details. A lot of times what staff needs is just the framework. Where do you think you want to go with this? And then we can give that to the departments, and they can really vet it with their staff and work it into their budget proposal that we see.
Yeah, okay. All right, good deal. So that's what we're going to do on the 5th. And there was one other thing you said, oh, the strategic plan. We're going to get an update on the strategic plan, so we.
Yeah, Ashley's been working on that. We just plan to put it in your info packet, not necessarily step through it with you. This is the last update we'll provide before you start a new process. But if you want to dedicate time on the 5th, we can. I mean, you'll be able to discuss it in the info packet anyway.
No, but we look forward to getting the report. We'll read it. Okay, anything else on that information packet?
Can I just clarify one thing? I want to make sure that I'm following the direction. We will have the budget on September 5th. Do you want the parking discussion on the 5th as well? Or is that something, otherwise we're probably in October.
I guess I don't feel it's super urgent, so I mean, if we would want to do it in October, I'd be fine with that.
Having it in October would allow our staff to better research some of the administrative elements that come along with the permit system.
Sure.
Okay.
If you could at least maybe communicate to Mark that that's what we're doing, so he
Sure.
knows that we're moving forward on it. Thank you.
Will do.
Okay, any other items on that information packet?
I have a question about IP10. It's looking like from the memo, Kelly, that the taxi community didn't really give us a lot of feedback in terms of needing to improve or modify our taxi regulations in light of the new Transportation Network ordinance. I forget, I should know his name by now.
Adil?
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 Adil. But I think really what he's bringing up through all these various public comments that he makes is a really good point, is this question of regulatory parity between taxi companies and Uber and the Transportation Network companies. Obviously, the legislature has taken away our ability to do anything vis-a-vis Uber, but it sounds like we still have some authority, and we want to make sure that we absolutely keep those regulations in place that protect the public safety. That's paramount for all of us, I know. But it just seems to me that we should, maybe in the next 90 days or 180 days, just review that, because I still get the sense that there are more regulations for the taxi company than there is for the Transportation Network company or networks. And I'm not really so convinced that the fact that you get it over the smartphone really justifies their getting such a lesser regulatory obligation. I don't know what people feel about it. It seems like the taxi companies weren't really complaining, though. But it's still something that's sort of on my mind.
Well, I'm really struck by the decline in the number of taxis and the number of taxi companies. It's really quite striking, and clearly is a function of Uber coming in, driving taxi companies out of business, basically. So it's really quite striking. But I think that Adil Adams was making a different point. He was asking for two things, if I understood correctly. Let's see if I can read my notes correctly.
We wanted the minimum vehicle
Yeah, I'm
requirement.
sorry.
to
He
be
wanted to
2
reduce the
instead of
minimum
4,
from
right.
4 to 2.
Right,
I wasn't
right.
clear on the material in our packet this time, what it actually is now. Is it 4? It is 4.
Yeah,
So
but apparently it was 2
originally.
and
Going
increased to
after
4 in
meetings with the
2012 or something,
companies,
right?
Yeah, they wanted an increase in vehicles to make it a little bit harder for companies, not harder for companies, but for the pop-up companies that come around football season time.
Oh,
And wanted people to be really invested in their company. So, to maybe pull together 2 vehicles isn't so hard, but, because they had thrown out like 6, and we tailored that back to 4.
That was pre-Uber, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, his point seemed valid to me. I mean, just on the face of it, without knowing how that industry works, it made sense that, it might be something, if it's 4 now, to go to 2. But
Sure, I mean, it would take looking at it, because if you go to 2 and we have the color scheme, you're going to run out of color schemes, for one. And I could see the number of companies increasing quite a bit if you drop down to 2.
I think both regulations were there may be additional reasons, but responding to a problem the community was experiencing with particularly with the football season, where you would get these pop-up companies that would come in, cater for those 7 or 8 football weekends, but not invest in anything else, and they weren't necessarily following all the regulations, but they knew that by the time the city caught up, that they would be out of business and they could just re-up again next year. There was also a lot of issues with customer service and people feeling like they were being treated unfairly. We were getting calls. The CVB was getting calls from people that were visiting the community. So there was a community discussion, including the cab companies at the time, and whether it was the June 1st, is it June 1st?
May 1st.
May 1st date.
Is the deadline for paper.
Or this renewal. Those were primarily designed to solve that problem. And of course, now we have some well-established taxi companies that are still operating that would probably come here and support keeping those regulations because they recall that. I'm not suggesting Mr. Adams has that motive in mind, but that's the reasoning for the regulations the way they are right now.
I think the other thing he drew attention to was that he missed the deadline date for applying for renewing his license.
He had come in before the deadline date, though, and had informed us that he wasn't going to renew. So.
Yeah. So then the other thing I think about is, and I think this is fair to say, he's not entirely fluent in English, though he's lived in Iowa City for several years. And I think it's probably pretty difficult for somebody who's not fluent in English to be able to understand these rules and respond to them in a timely fashion and do all that kind of stuff as you're supposed to do. And yet my guess is, I don't know this as a fact, that he's also providing a service to other Sudanese residents. I don't know that as a fact. But it just strikes me as a difficult situation for one person. And he's come to us many times now. This is probably the 6th time he's shown up in a public discussion period and had some concern about the taxi ordinance. So is there anything we should consider doing? And if so, we'd probably have to change the ordinance.
I guess we should just probably keep an eye out for it. I mean, I think as the taxi cab companies review their ability to stay competitive in relation to Uber, I just think we have to keep an open mind to do a potential work session on this, sort of my thought.
Well, my initial thought is, do you regularly have meetings for the taxi cab companies?
Not on a regular basis.
I guess I'd be interested to see, I'm not trying to put more work on you, but what that collective body, in the same sense of they came together to discuss some of the changes that, were put forth before, and then came together, I believe, when discussion about Uber was, thrown out there. I would see it'd be reasonable to have another kind of discussion with some of these additional things as well, to see whether or not there needs to be changes, and then kind of send that back to us.
Well,
It seems to me we'd be hearing from others if they felt there needed to be changes. I mean, are we going to start every time one person comes in and complains about some of our ordinances?
These are, what Mr. Adams is talking about are barriers to entry into this market. I think if you go and ask the taxi cabs that are existing today that are still successful despite the Uber, they're going to be interested in protecting. They're not going to want to make it easier for competitors to come in. So I don't think if you go and talk to the 5 existing companies, they're going to say, sure, lower that threshold to 2 cars or make it a rolling application period, because they're surviving under the tougher barriers to entry into the market. They're probably going to come back with a whole other list of things that they would like us to reconsider, color scheme or reporting requirements, 24/7, just phone requirements. They're going to have other things that they want to open up. So if you're just looking at Mr. Adams' 2 concerns, I'm not sure. We can check with the existing companies, but I can pretty much tell you what they'll probably say on those 2 items.
You know how long he'd been licensed as a taxi company in Iowa City?
Not off the top of my, it's several years he was, previous, so.
I mean, I guess the real reason I also wanted some additional, thought to that is, you know, if we were talking about the fact that there was a lack of reinvestment in the community, could there be a change to the ordinance that would focus on the time limit that a business has been opened in Iowa City? And so you just said that this individual had been open for 2 to 3 years. Is that a change or a stipulation that we could have to accommodate? I'm just throwing that out there literally as I'm thinking about it. That's why I think there's other people that have more expertise in kind of thinking about that. Or on the opposite front, I mean, if this is a language barrier issue or something else, can we make sure that we have then that frank conversation? Because I've had those in my job where it's been discussed where it seems like there's that language barrier issue where the information is not being communicated or articulated clearly, that we just kind of have that frank conversation with somebody else or whoever to make sure that we're clear about some of those guidelines as we move forward.
If you'd only had a license for a year or two and missed it, I'd be more inclined to think that that might be the issue, but if he's had it for several years, it would seem to me that the individual was able to and understood the permitting process every year.
I don't like to assume.
Well,
All right, well, I don't sense any strong desire to ask staff to revise the ordinance or
No.
anything like that, so, but I thought I think it's valuable to acknowledge at least that we have heard a deal and have read what he submitted to us and talked about it and decided not to do anything different. Okay, is there anything else in that info packet?
So IP5, I didn't know where we were at, so I'm glad we stepped on that. I had a really good conversation with Paul Cienfuegos. Finally said that name right, even though I've been saying Sigfos for forever. And I think Susan was at a meeting maybe a year ago.
A year and a half or 2 years ago.
In regards when we talked about community rights. You know, I would say this, there's a lot of information that he shared in a short amount of time about kind of a community rights ordinance and what's happened in, I think, Spokane, Washington, and some of the other things. I do think that when I was talking with him about this, it had direct relation to the minimum wage ordinance. You know, I felt like the legislature in general has, for me, or at least in my perspective, has basically just attacked Iowa City. And so there's been some things that I think have frankly been focused on Iowa City compared to other places or other municipalities across the state. That being said, I do think the minimum wage ordinance was more of a county situation, but I do feel this is a particular opportunity where we could say, you know, and again, help me out, Eleanor, because I think that when we had that conversation, I looked back at your memo before I put this in the packet, a lot of the conversation was really focused on that this was in the health and welfare piece of kind of home rule authority. And I just feel like from a city home rule perspective, that is one of the few things that as a city we regulate, our own residents and their own health and welfare in our borders. And so I just felt like this was an opportunity to bring up, because he really galvanized me around kind of this community rights ordinance and what this could mean for one issue being the minimum wage that I think was kind of taken away with that preemptive bill. And just wanted an opportunity to kind of discuss, maybe not right now because we're now late in the night, it's almost 10 o'clock, but discuss in the future kind of what this means and what this could possibly mean as far as stances that we can take kind of against state legislation in general. I know that, Jim, you had mentioned not too long ago, and maybe it was a kind of a conversation with Jeff that it was kind of at the end of the council meeting, but kind of talking about how we need to prepare for the next kind of legislative session. And I agree with that, but it also seems like we're on the defensive a lot on, you know, well, we're just going to see what happens from that session and not necessarily, you know, be kind of clear about what our intentions are and what we're not going to budge on. So not trying to light a fire on anybody at 10 o'clock at night, and I didn't expect to be talking about this late, but for me, I'm just requesting kind of a work session to kind of talk about this issue. I hadn't talked about it with Eleanor. I was kind of hoping this was an opportunity to see if there was council interest to bring it up later on and discuss not only maybe a community rights ordinance, but maybe also bringing up the minimum wage debate.
Well, we talked about it a little bit during the work session.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think, John, you were the one that brought it up, and we're talking a little bit about it. And I'd mentioned that I had been to the meeting 1.5 or 2 years ago when he was here, and found what he was saying very interesting and compelling. And then Jim made the comment, and I have to admit, I have not read the Iowa Constitution, but basically, I've read the U.S. one, but not the Iowa one.
I haven't read the Iowa one either.
But basically, that city, and Eleanor obviously could tell us more, but the cities don't exist except under Iowa law. So, I mean, I guess I would be interested, if anything, of having Eleanor maybe look at this, and without going too deep into the weeds, you know, is there even any would we even have any legal standing to do any of this stuff in the state of Iowa? I mean, Paul goes all around the country, and obviously state laws and state constitutions are totally different from state to state. So Spokane might have more legal standing to do some of this than we might here. So if we have absolutely zero legal standing to do any of this sort of thing, there's no point in wasting our time. But if we do, you know, if there's any chance, yeah, I would be interested in having a little bit of discussion on it.
The framework's really pretty simple, even though it's not particularly favorable. The Iowa Constitution does guarantee home rule as a constitutional right, but in the Constitution it says subject to the acts of the General Assembly. And so that's why you get state preemption. And if they are explicit about preempting you, I mean, that's the easiest way for them to do it. There's other ways they can do it, but when they say you can't do this, there's not much way around that. And some of the details of the community rights, I think it's fine to you know, state values and state rights, to provide remedies that are like some of the Spokane stuff is providing remedies, like suggesting that a court has jurisdiction over certain things. I think can be a little misleading, because you're saying you've got a remedy for someone when there really isn't that remedy available. So that's kind of the basic framework.
Yeah, I think it would be politically untimely for us to take up this particular topic. I think if we adopted some kind of worker Bill of Rights ordinance, a lot of it would end up being preempted by the state legislature. We'd probably end up in some kind of big political fight. And we have all sorts of other things we want to be accomplishing. So I think it'd be a mistake to take it up right now.
Well, but we don't have.
At some point.
But we don't have to. You're suggesting a work session, and I think there are home rule problems with this when you talk about that. But even if we end up with just saying, you know what, Eleanor comes with a memo and says, you know, look, the specific remedy that you seek, we just don't have the home rule authority, then maybe we end up with just a proclamation and say, you know what, we believe in home rule, we believe in democracy closest to the people, and that's where we're at. And I think in terms of the fight, Jim, I think that may be a healthy issue to have a little bit more declaratory statements in terms of what our values are. So I would at least like a lot of people have brought this up to me as well, at least a work session on it, so we can have a well-developed articulation of this issue. And if nothing else, we end up with a proclamation. I think that would be valuable. And we can pretty much proclaim on anything, can't we? It's sort of there's nothing limiting our ability to express our political view as a council, right? So I would support a work session.
Well, I don't object to a work session about it. If there's support from a couple other people, we could put it on the pending list.
I think we have other topics that we have more ability to actually get things done on that I'd rather focus time on at this point. Plus, even though we may not be able to do anything, I think going into the 2018 legislative session, there's no point in doing anything that isn't going to be constructive and yet draws attention to us from the legislature.
I want to draw attention to that. But.
I don't. They've done enough, and so.
So you need 3 to get it on, don't you?
I mean, I'm kind of two minds on this. I I think it would be useful to have a public conversation about it. It is, not that we would necessarily act on it, but that there is, you know, there have been discussions. This is a topic that is of concern. I'd be interested personally to know, you know, how are other, I mean, because this is kind of a national phenomenon. This is not unique to Iowa. And what, if any, actions are being considered or what discussions are taking place in other cities. Because, yeah, we were hit pretty hard. And there was a sense of hopelessness or helplessness. So I think, yes, trying to take ownership of the situation on some level would potentially be at least informative, if not empowering. That, you know.
I'm going to modify what I said a little bit ago. I believe it's politically untimely to take on this kind of discussion. It would be a mistake to have this kind of discussion before the legislature closes its session in May or whenever it is they stop of 2018. I agree with Susan about this. We don't want to have attention drawn to this when we don't know that there's anything really that's going to come of value. But more importantly, we got a whole bunch of stuff to do between now and the time our terms end. And I want to get that stuff done. I think it really matters. That's why we're here. Let's do it and not get distracted by other stuff that, you know, emotionally and politically I kind of agree with, but I think it'd be a big distraction for us and not be very productive. So,
I would just say this, you know, if this was a conversation that the legislature had decided that they want to, you know, possibly mitigate climate change, I would hope that we would, and take away some of our ability to, you know, work on that from a council level. I'd hope that we would collectively come together and want to do something about that. So I will remove my proposal, but again, I just don't want to sit and take it from a legislature. So,
well, we're not going to just sit and take it. I mean, there are lots of conversations about things we should be doing, but I think holding a work session on this particular topic so that the next thing you know, it's in the news, we're doing this, that distracts attention from what we're trying to accomplish. And so I think it's just a mistake to go down that road at this moment in time. But
I think we're on that line sort of powerless, so to speak. You say sit back and take it, but they're the rule makers, and what they say, unless we can get around it somehow.
I mean, I think to Jim's point, a more timely point if we want to do this, as he said, is after the legislature has closed in the spring, and if you want, then doing it and trying to use it as motivation for people in terms of the election next fall.
Yeah.
We are not sitting back and taking it, but when you strategize, you have to look at what strategies you think may or may not be successful. We have some litigation strategies, we have some legislative strategies, but we're not at all, I think, sitting back and taking it.
Right.
When the Constitution is that clear, I mean, there's not a whole lot that you can do from that regard. So.
And also, just to be clear, I asked for a conversation. I wasn't saying that we were going to sue or pursue any type of effort in general. I just wanted a more in-depth conversation than a 10-minute conversation at 10 o'clock at night. That's all.
Could we have it set out like 9 months from now?
Like I said, I remove
You remove it?
I remove it.
I think bring it back up after the legislature's done.
Yeah, bring it back up afterwards. All right, I think we're done with the work session. All right, work session is adjourned.
You're watching City Channel 4. On TV, online, on demand, on Facebook, and now on the go on your mobile device.